Hi, it's Grandma here, and I'm reading Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain, and I'm going to be reading chapter 17. Chapter 16 was more about their life on the island, and that the boys are getting very homesick. Joe and Huck even were on their way home when Tom stopped them with a great idea. So they decided to stay, and meanwhile there's been a bad thunderstorm which really scared them, and they decided to be Indians instead of pirates. So chapter 17, an interrupted funeral. There was no hilarity in the little town the same tranquil Saturday afternoon. The Harpers and Aunt Polly's family were being put into mourning with great grief and many tears. An unusual quiet possessed the village, although it was ordinarily quiet enough in all conscience. The villagers conducted their concerns with an absent air and talked little, but they sighed often. The Saturday holidays seemed a burden to the children. They had no heart in their sports and gradually gave them up. In the afternoon, Becky Thatcher found herself moping about the deserted schoolyard, feeling very melancholy, but she found nothing there to comfort her and much to remember her sorrow. She soliloquized, "Oh, if I only had his brass iron knob again, but I haven't got anything now to remember him by." And she choked back a little sob. Presently she stopped and said to herself, "It was right here. Oh, it was to do over again. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say it for the whole world, but he's gone now, and I'll never, never, never see him anymore." This thought broke her down, and she wandered away with tears rolling down her cheeks. Then quite a group of boys and girls, playmates of Tom's and Joe's, came by and stood looking over the paling fence and talking in reverent tones of how Tom did so-and-so the last time they saw him, and how Joe said this and that small trifle, pregnant with awful prophecy as they could easily see now. Each speaker pointed out the exact spot where the lost lad stood at the time, and then added something like, "And I was standing just so, just as I am now, and as if you was him, I was as close as that. And he smiled just that way. And then something seemed to go all over me like awful, and I never thought what it meant, of course, but now I see it." Then there was a dispute about who saw the dead boys last in life, and many claimed that dismal distinction and offered evidences, more or less tampered with by the witness, and when it was ultimately decided who did see the lucky parties, took upon themselves a sort of sacred importance and were gaped at and envied by all the rest. One poor chap, who had no other grandeur to offer, said with tolerably manifest pride in the remembrance, "Well, Tom Sawyer, he licked me once." But that bid for glory was a failure. Most of the boys could say that, and so that cheapened the distinction too much. The group loitered away, still recalling memories of the lost heroes in awed voices. I'm going to pause here. Now, when the boys there say that he licked him, they don't mean that they stuck his tongue out and licked him. It means he beat them in a fight. Also, don't forget that the boys had warned their friends that something big was going to happen. They didn't tell them what, and that's what they're kind of talking about here. When the Sunday school hour was finished the next morning, the bell began to toll. Instead of ringing in its usual way, it was a very still Sabbath, and the mournful sound seemed in keeping with the musing hush that lay upon nature. The villagers began to gather, loitering a moment in the vestibule to converse in whispers about the sad event. But there was no whispering in the house, only the funereal rustling of dresses as the women gathered to their seats disturbed the silence there. None could remember when the little church had been so full before. There was finally a waiting pause and expectant dumbness, and then Aunt Polly entered, followed by Sid and Mary, and then by the Harper family, all in deep black, and the whole congregation, the old minister as well, rose reverently and stood until the mourners were seated in the front pew. There was another communing silence, broken at intervals by muffled sobs, and then the minister spread his hands abroad and prayed. Now, I want you to note that the kids in the schoolyard, no one has mentioned Huckleberry Finn. And although Tom has family and Joe has family, nobody from Huckleberry Finn's family has shown up. Okay. A moving hymn was sung, and the text followed, "I am the resurrection and the life." As the service proceeded, the clergyman drew such pictures of the graces, the winning ways, and the rare promise of the lost lads that every soul there, thinking he recognized these pictures, felt a pang in remembering that he had persistently blinded himself to them and had as persistently seen only faults and flaws in these three poor boys. The minister related many a touching incident in the lives of the departed too, which illustrated their sweet, generous natures, and the people could easily see now how noble and beautiful these episodes were, and remembered with grief that at the time they occurred, they had seemed rank rascalities, well deserving of the cowhide, meaning they were whipped with a belt. The congregation became more and more moved as the pathetic tale went on, till at last the whole company broke down and joined the weeping mourners in a chorus of anguished sobs, the preacher himself giving way to his feelings and crying in the pulpit. There was a rustle in the gallery, which nobody noticed. A moment later, the church door creaked. The minister raised his streaming eyes above his handkerchief and then stood transfixed. First one, and then another pair of eyes followed the minister's. Then almost with one impulse, the congregation rose and stared while the three dead boys came marching up the aisle, Tom in the lead, Joe next, and Huck, a ruin of drooping rags, sneaking sheepishly in the rear. They had been hiding in the unused gallery and listened to their own funeral sermon. And here's a picture of them. Aunt Polly, Mary, and the Harpers threw themselves upon their restored ones, smothered them with kisses, and poured out thanksgiving while poor Huck stood abashed and uncomfortable, not knowing exactly what to do or where to hide from so many unwelcoming eyes. He wavered and started to slink away, but Tom seized him and said, "Aunt Polly, it ain't fair. Somebody's got to be glad to see Huck." "And so they shall be. I'm glad to see him, poor motherless thing." And the loving attentions Aunt Polly lavished upon him were the one thing capable of making him more uncomfortable than he was before. Suddenly, the minister shouted at the top of his voice, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Sing and put your hearts into it." And they did. 100 swelled up with a triumphant burst, and while it shook the rafters, Tom Sawyer, the pirate, looked around upon the envying juveniles about him and confessed in his heart that this was by far the proudest moment of his life. As the souled congregation trooped out, they said they would almost be willing to be made ridiculous again to hear Old 100 sung like that once more. Tom got more cuffs and kisses that day, according to Aunt Polly's varying moods, than he had earned before in a year, and he hardly knew which expressed the most gratefulness to God and affection for himself. Well, that was a short chapter, but the next one's kind of long, so I'm going to wait and read it. Anyway, this would be a good ending to the book, wouldn't it? Do we have any loose ends yet? Well, yes, there's the Becky Thatcher story, which is illustrated here in the book. What about Injun Joe? Yeah, there's a problem with him too. And is Huckleberry going to always be without anyone loving or caring for him? Well, we'll find out. We still have almost half the book to go. Bye-bye.